Hello, I'm Dr. Ron England, and I'm going to take you through a very short lecture, but covering big picture of data objects in .NET. So I kind of call it Data Objects in .NET Part 1. So let's look a little bit at the architecture. And as we do this, we kind of want to look at a few things, like why is it set up the way it is? So let's say we're working in a programming language and we want to work with data. Well, if you're working in a programming language like C# or any object-oriented programming language, what you'd really like to be able to do is have a set of objects that you can use, like that are common, that don't change depending upon the type of database that you're using. So we've got these common objects in system.data in that namespace, like the data set, the data table, data row, data column, data relation, data view, and they encapsulate the functionality of what you would get from tables and hierarchical databases. So like a data table would contain specifically the information you get out of a table in a database. And a data set can contain multiple tables, but can also contain relations. So it's a little bit higher level of what you would be able to do in a database. And what we really want is that to be completely separated from the database that you're using. These are the objects that you can use all the time and manipulate to do things. Now, the reality is that you have to connect with real databases. So we have these over here, what I'm calling database-specific objects, but they're not necessarily that specific, like the SQL Server. In a namespace system.data.SQL client, you've got things like a SQL connection and a SQL command and a SQL data adapter. And those are ones that are specific to a connection that you make using the objects in the SQL client, which is specific to using SQL Server. Now, Microsoft gives you some flexibility here because they've got things like the OLEDB and the ODBC, which are actually more generic. So if you were to use an OLEDB connection here, that connection itself would look a lot like a SQL connection and have a lot of the same, basically the same properties, but it connects to a database that was OLEDB compliant, meaning that it actually had a driver for OLEDB. And ODBC has its own set of drivers, and you can connect to ODBC compliant databases using the specific objects to that namespace. But they all look essentially the same. This little underscore here could be replaced by either SQL, OLEDBC, or ODBC, and they would work the same way. So you can kind of see this, if you're in the system.data namespace, there's some stuff in here that, that is used generically in the programming, like the data table, that is not dependent upon the database that's underneath. But underneath this, you have the SQL client and the OLEDB client, which have their own versions of these objects, like the SQL command object or the SQL connection object, that are the versions of the object that are specific to that driver. Now, the common stuff that you have, the SystemData Classes, like a data set, data table, data row, data column, data relation, data view manager. There's more than just these objects that are underneath this system.data, but they have specific purposes that are generic. So I think it kind of struck home that these objects here can be used generically, and you don't care what the underlying database is. A data set is a data set. In C#, in .NET, a data set is always the same, regardless of what the underlying database that you're using is. And they do provide a very nice standardized method and API to be able to access the databases. Okay, and OLEDB is probably the most commonly used. It's relatively straightforward to use. The overall structure looks something like this. You write code over here on the left-hand side. You have access through these objects that have access through specific providers, which then take you all the way back to the original data sources like SQL Server or MDB, which would be accessed, and they can all be accessed via OLEDB. So one of the things that's important to note is that if you're accessing SQL Server, you can access it using the SQL client objects or the OLEDB client objects, or even the ODBC, because it's compliant with all three. So how do you use this? It's really basic stuff here. You want to get stuff to and from a database. Step one is to create a connection. And you're going to choose which connection class you want to use there. So if you know that you're going to be using SQL Server as your backend database, and you're always going to be using SQL Server, the SQL connection object is quite sufficient to do this. Whereas if you might be using a more generic database that might change, an OLEDB would be the same, and that means that you wouldn't really have to change anything other than the connection string to get to it. And a connection string is just that. It's a string that defines basically the key of how do you get to that database. So in code it would look something like this. Create a connection string, okay, which is actually a string. Con string is my connection string here, and it's a string. In this case, I'm going to connect to a access file. Okay, that's what this does. From that, I create a connection, an actual connection object that connects to that database, and the database is defined where it is. This is an actual file that I'm going to connect to that has database information. The drivers are specified, everything is there, and I'm going to create an object called an OLEDB connection that can connect to that access database file. I open it, I can do stuff, and then I can close it. So once I have connected to that, I got to have a place to put data. Okay, a good common object for that, remember I said there's some common objects for that, is a data set. I can create a new data set in C# very easily. Dataset ds equals new data set. Okay, I may not actually need to create a data set. Data sets are very useful if I need to bring results back from the database and store them somewhere. They can be stored inside of a data set. But if I create a data set, I can then go to the next step, which is create an adapter and fill it. So in this case, I'll create an OLEDB adapter. Okay, and here I use the constructor, and the constructor specifically that I use takes the connection object. That would be the connection object I created in the last slide. So I can construct an adapter that takes a connection object. Now this adapter, which sits between the two, can do stuff. I can set the select command of that adapter to be equal to select star from table, and then using the adapter.fill, passing it the data set, remember ds was the name of the data set, it will execute the SQL and fill up this data set with the results. And now everything is accessible to me in this object ds, which is a data set. Now, the data adapter has properties to do things like inserts, deletes, selects, and updates, and it can actually have separate commands for each of those. So I can call delete or insert, and I can call it and tell it to do those different things. Okay, so looking at this, I've got a lot of other objects, by the way. I'm covering these basic objects, the adapter, the data set, the connection, very simply so that you can get an understanding of the architecture of how the whole thing works. You can do much more complex stuff, and you have the ability to use other objects which allow you to do more complex stuff. Like you can create a command object, which is like a SQL command, which has more complex, it can be parameterized. Okay. Essentially, though, you're still doing the same thing. You're creating a connection, okay, establishing a way to communicate between the database using the connection and the adapter, and filling generic objects with information, okay, with the stuff from the data that you can use in your program. So let's look at that structure again one more time. You've got these system.data objects like a data set or a data table. Okay, you have these database specific objects that we looked at like a SQL connector or a SQL adapter or an OLEDB connector. And you have an adapter that sits between them. The adapter is within those database specific classes because they have to actually deal with the database. But what they do is they actually allow you to populate stuff over here. And it's not just one way. If you notice, it goes both ways. The arrow goes both directions. So that, in a nutshell, is the basic architecture of .NET data objects. Now we're going to be doing a lot more stuff with a lot more objects, but it's good to understand the basics of how those objects work. Thank you very much.